In this episode, we are going to make a group of Windows network settings feel much less confusing by tying each one to a very simple question a technician needs to answer. When a user says they cannot open a shared folder, reach a printer, sign in the way they used to, or get to a website at work, the computer may not be broken at all. Very often, the real issue is that Windows is using the wrong identity model, the wrong sharing setup, the wrong firewall behavior, or the wrong path for network traffic. That is why domain settings, workgroup settings, file and printer sharing, firewall choices, and proxy settings matter so much on Windows clients. They decide who the computer thinks the user is, what the computer is willing to talk to, and how traffic is allowed to move. Once you understand those settings in a beginner-friendly way, network support becomes much more logical and much less like random guessing. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber-authored in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to understand this topic is to focus on 3 ideas that show up again and again in support work. The first idea is identity, which means how Windows knows who a user is and whether that user should be trusted for certain tasks. The second idea is reachability, which means whether one device can actually talk to another device or service across the network. The third idea is access, which means whether the user is allowed to use the thing they reached, such as a folder, a printer, or a web resource. Many support calls are really a mix of those 3 ideas. A user may be on the correct network, but signed in with the wrong kind of account. A user may be allowed to use a shared folder, but blocked by firewall settings that stop the traffic before it gets there. A user may have working local network access, but fail to browse the web because a proxy setting is wrong. When you keep identity, reachability, and access in mind, the topic starts to feel much more organized. A workgroup is usually the easier starting point because it fits the way many home and small office computers operate. In a workgroup, each Windows computer is mostly responsible for itself. It keeps track of its own local user accounts, its own settings, and its own decisions about what to share. That means there is no central system controlling identity for every machine in the group. If several computers are in the same workgroup, they can still see each other and share resources, but they do not automatically trust one another just because they are nearby. For a beginner, the simple way to think about a workgroup is that each computer is its own small island that can cooperate with other islands when configured to do so. This can work well in small environments because it is simple and does not require a larger management system. But it also means support can become more manual because each machine has to be checked and managed more individually. A domain is built for a different kind of environment. Instead of each computer acting mostly on its own, a domain gives the organization a more central way to manage identity, settings, and access across many systems. When a Windows client is joined to a domain, the user can often sign in with one set of organizational credentials and use that identity across several computers and shared resources, depending on what they have been allowed to access. That makes support easier in larger environments because there is more consistency and more central control. A beginner should not confuse this kind of domain with the kind of domain name used on the internet. In Windows support, a domain is about managed identity inside an organization. That difference matters because a domain can change how users sign in, how resources are shared, and how settings are applied. It is not just a label. It changes the whole support model for the Windows client. The biggest practical difference between a workgroup and a domain shows up when users try to prove who they are. In a workgroup, a user often signs in with a local account that belongs only to that one computer. That account may work perfectly on that machine and still mean nothing on a nearby machine unless matching accounts or permissions are set up there too. In a domain, the user identity is usually more centralized, so the same sign-in can work across multiple domain-joined systems and services if the organization has allowed it. This is why domain environments often feel smoother to users in schools and businesses. They do not have to remember separate local identities for every shared resource they use. For a beginner technician, this is a major lesson. If access fails in a workgroup, the problem may be that the user is known only on one machine. If access fails in a domain, the issue may be tied to central identity, central permissions, or the client's connection to the domain environment rather than to the resource itself. File sharing makes much more sense once you understand that Windows is not only deciding whether a folder exists. It is also deciding whether that folder is being offered to the network and whether the user coming from another machine is allowed to open it. A folder can be present on a computer and still not be shared at all. A folder can be shared and still be blocked to certain users. A user may even be able to see that a shared folder exists without being allowed to open it or change the files inside it. For beginners, this is where many confusing support calls begin. Someone says the network is broken because they cannot get into a shared folder, but the network may be fine. The real issue may be that sharing is turned off, the user does not have permission, or the identity being presented by the other machine is not the one the host computer expects. Good technicians remember that file sharing is not just about visibility. It is about both reachability and permission at the same time. Printer sharing follows the same basic pattern, even though users often describe it very differently. A shared printer is still a network resource, which means the Windows client trying to use it must be able to find it, reach the host or print path, and use an identity that is allowed to print there. The printer may be healthy and fully connected to the host machine, while the user on another computer still cannot print because sharing is disabled, the host is offline, or the client cannot reach the printer path across the network. A beginner should think of shared printing as file sharing with a different purpose. The network still has to be working, the sharing still has to be enabled, and the user still has to be allowed. When people say the printer is down, that may mean the printer hardware failed, but it may just as easily mean the Windows sharing path around the printer failed. That is why technicians should check the sharing model before assuming the physical printer itself is the real problem. The relationship between identity and sharing becomes very important when you compare workgroups and domains. In a workgroup, sharing can feel less smooth because each machine is still treating identities locally unless the setup was carefully planned. A user may be signed into one computer and still be treated like a stranger by another computer on the same network. That creates the common beginner support problem where the user can see a shared resource but gets blocked when trying to use it. In a domain, access often feels more natural because the shared resource can trust the same broader organizational identity the user already used at sign-in. That does not mean every domain user can open every shared folder or printer. Permissions still matter, but it does mean the identity model is more unified. For a technician, this is useful because an access denied message does not always mean something is broken. It may simply mean the user's identity was not known, was not trusted in the right way, or did not have permission for that resource. Windows firewall settings are another major part of this topic because even correct sharing and correct identity do not help if the network traffic itself is being blocked. A firewall on a Windows client is there to control what kinds of network traffic are allowed in and out. That is useful because it helps reduce risk and keeps the computer from being too open to the network. At the same time, if the firewall settings are too restrictive for the environment, normal sharing and support tasks may stop working. A beginner should think of the firewall as a traffic gatekeeper. It decides whether certain kinds of communication are allowed to pass. If the user cannot browse to a shared folder, cannot discover another device, or cannot be reached by a support tool, the firewall may be part of the reason even if the network cable, wireless connection, and user account all seem fine. That is why firewall thinking belongs in normal support work, not only in high-security conversations. Network profile choice makes firewall behavior easier to understand. Windows usually treats networks differently, depending on whether they are seen as more private and trusted or more public and untrusted. A home or office network where trusted devices need to discover each other often works better with settings that allow more local sharing behavior. A public wireless network in an airport or coffee shop should usually be treated more cautiously so the machine does not expose itself too openly. This matters because a user can move from one place to another and suddenly experience a change that feels like a failure even though Windows is just behaving more carefully. A shared printer may disappear. File sharing may stop. Another computer may no longer be able to see this client on the network. For a beginner, the lesson is simple. The firewall is not only about blocking danger from strangers. It also changes how friendly or closed the computer feels to normal local sharing, depending on what kind of network Windows believes it is on. This is why support questions around reachability need careful wording. If a user says the shared folder disappeared, the technician should not jump straight to the folder itself. The better question is whether the client can still reach the other machine at all, and whether Windows is allowing the kind of traffic that shared folders and printers depend on. A firewall problem often feels like a network problem to the user because the result looks the same from their point of view. They click, and nothing useful happens. But a technician needs to know whether the path is broken or merely blocked by policy on the client. This matters even more when remote support tools, discovery tools, or sharing features work on one network and not on another. That pattern often points toward firewall or network profile behavior rather than toward failing hardware. Beginners get better at support when they stop hearing only the symptom and start asking what kind of traffic needs to pass for the user's goal to succeed. Proxy settings introduce another part of network behavior that beginners often miss because proxy problems can look like general internet failure. A proxy is a system that sits in the path between the user's computer and the web resources the user wants to reach. Instead of the client going straight to the internet, the traffic may go through the proxy first. Organizations use proxies for different reasons, such as filtering, logging, controlling access, or managing how web traffic moves out to the internet. In a home setting, many users do not need to think about proxies at all. In a business or school environment, proxy settings can matter a great deal. If the Windows client has the wrong proxy setting, the user may be on the network, signed in correctly, and able to reach local resources, yet still fail to open outside websites or cloud services. That can be very confusing until you understand that the path to those resources may be going through an extra checkpoint. The most useful beginner lesson about proxy settings is this. A proxy problem does not always break everything. It often breaks certain kinds of web access while leaving local network access alone. A user may still reach a nearby printer, a shared folder, or another device on the same network and yet be unable to browse external websites or sign into an online service. That pattern matters because it tells you the local connection may be healthy while the web path is not. Wrong proxy settings can happen for several ordinary reasons. A device may have been used on a different network before. An old company setting may still be present. A browser or Windows setting may still be pointing traffic to a proxy that no longer exists or is no longer reachable from the current location. For a technician, that is a powerful clue. It means the computer is not simply offline. It may be using the wrong route for web traffic. All of these pieces come together in a very practical way when you think through a simple support call. Suppose a user says they cannot open a shared drive, print to the office printer, or reach a business website. A rushed technician might blame the whole network, but a calmer technician breaks the problem apart. Is this Windows client in a workgroup or a domain? What kind of identity is the user signed in with? Is the resource local to the network or out on the web? Is sharing enabled on the host side? Is the firewall allowing the needed communication? Is web traffic supposed to go through a proxy? And is that proxy setting correct for this machine right now? Those questions are not advanced tricks. They are just a clean way to separate identity, reachability, and access. Once you do that, the problem becomes smaller and easier to explain instead of feeling like one huge and mysterious network failure. By the end of this topic, the main pattern should feel much clearer. Workgroups are simpler and more local, but they often require more manual thinking about user identity and shared access from one machine to another. Domains provide more centralized identity and management, which usually makes larger environments easier to support. File and printer sharing depend on both visibility and permission, so seeing a resource is not the same as being allowed to use it. Windows firewall settings affect whether the needed traffic can pass, and network profile choices change how open or cautious the client behaves on different networks. Proxy settings can change the path to web resources and create internet-like failures even when the local network is working normally. When beginners understand how these settings shape identity, reachability, and access, Windows client networking becomes far less confusing. The computer stops feeling unpredictable, and the technician can explain clearly whether the issue is who the user is, what path the traffic is taking, or what Windows is allowing that traffic to do.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.